Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome to the Berlin Study Abroad presentation. We are very excited to share about our time in Berlin. Yay! Yay! Woo! Yeah. After we all applied and got accepted to the abroad, we took a 15-week course on fascism and Nazism. This class covered what fascism is, how it took root in Germany, and how the Nazis came to power. At the end of December, we all separately made our way to Berlin for the beginning of the abroad. The title of this abroad was The Legality of Totalitarianism, which is quite intimidating, but we broke it down with 2 courses in country, a course on jurisprudence and a course on German country studies. Our time in Berlin was broken up into 3 sections. Week 1 was focused on German history before the Nazis. Week 2, we focused on the 12 years the Nazis were in power. And week 3, we explored post-Nazi Germany. Now that you have an idea of what our abroad covered, we would like to introduce our group. My name is William Johnson, and I am an economics major with minors in global studies and educational studies.
Thank you. I have a stutter, but my name is Eloise Essex. I'm a double major in history and dance with a minor in education. Was there anything else? And I'm a senior.
Hello everybody, I'm Mateus. I'm a sophomore, undecided major, and I'm from Brazil.
I'm Rafter Sprague. I'm from San Diego, California, and I am a double major in physics and history, and I am a junior.
I'm Ari. I'm a senior with a double major in English and studio art.
I'm Grace. I'm a senior from Los Angeles. I am double majoring in English and history and minoring in education and philosophy.
I'm Aubrey Hawk. I'm a senior. I'm a history major with minors in gender, sexuality, and women's studies and sociology and anthropology.
I'm Tobin Blair. I'm a sophomore with no declared major.
I'm Gloria. I'm from Kigali, Rwanda, and I am majoring in chemistry and sociology and anthropology.
I'm Chris Adwoga. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya, and I'm a double mass comm and poli-sci major with a minor in economics.
Okay, now we will get started with a video that gives you an overview of our time in country. This will be followed by a presentation on our key takeaways from the abroad, and then we will finish with a Q&A. Thank you so much for coming, and we hope you enjoy.
Ist grad weg, ich hab ne halbe Stunde Zeit. Manchmal ist es schön, einfach nur zu sein. Manchmal bist du da, und doch bin ich allein. Manchmal ist ne halbe Stunde die Unendlichkeit. Die Gedanken sind ja frei. Und grad sind sie bei dir, vielleicht kommst du ja vorbei und wartest neben mir für eine Stunde oder 2.
Listen. Listen. Shh. Listen to the stillness. This is the stillness of the voices that were taken away from us. People who lived here and there and 2 streets away, Montregebirtig. Voices that were taken from us. We are the voices that are left. We must be their voice carrying their song. And so we will do the hymn of the survivors, of those who fought and those who survived. Never say that you've walked the final way, though leaden skies obscure the light of day. The hour we longed for will certainly appear, and our steps will proclaim we are still here. Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg. Gott Himmel bleibe, verstellen neue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte schon. Es wird abbeugt von unser Trott, wir seien da. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte schon. Es wird abbeugt von unser Trott, wir seien da. Vom grünen Palmenland bis weißen Land von Schnee. Wir kommen heut mit unser Pein, mit unser Weh. Und jeder spritzt, was ihm gefällt, unser Blut. Sprotzen wird dort unser Gwure, unser Mut. Von jedem spritzt, was ihm gefällt, von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird dort unser Gwure, unser Mut. Das Lied geschrieben ist nicht Blut und nicht mit Blei. Es ist nicht kein Liedl von Erfolge oder frei. Das hat Erfolg zwischen fallig gewinnt. Das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in die Hände. Das hat Erfolg zwischen fallig gewinnt. Das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in die Hände. Da sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg. Hat Schimmeln bleierne, verstellen neue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Show. Es wird abbeugt an unser Trott, wir seien da. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Show. Es wird abbeugt an unser Trott, wir seien da.
Ich liege auf den kalten Fliesen. Sie sind weiß, sie sind polar. Du fühlst dich an wie eine Landschaft, in der ich oft verloren war. Ich schau verliebt ins Fadenkreuz, die Sirenen singen mich in Trance. Ich hör nicht auf, nach dir zu suchen. Ich lasse mich frei, du lässt mich schweben. Ich kann meine Beine nicht bewegen. Zwischen Skill und Charybdis, es ist eine Odyssee. Zwischen Skill und Charybdis, bis ich dich wiedersehe. Ich finde dich in einer Höhle. Mir ist warm mit dir im Eis. Um dich herum glitzert das Schöne, für das ich 1000 Meilen reis. Ich schau verliebt ins Fadenkreuz, die Sirenen singen mich in Trance. Ich hör nicht auf, nach dir zu suchen. Ich lasse mich fallen, du lässt mich schweben. Ich kann meine Beine nicht bewegen. Siehst du lauter Rückwärts, es ist eine Odyssee. Siehst du lauter Rückwärts, bis ich dich wiedersehe.
Okay, thank you, Aubrey, for that video. Now that you have an idea of what our time in Berlin looked like, we would like to share some key lessons and personal takeaways from our time in museums, the classroom, and at historical sites. The way we are presenting our takeaways is based on the structure of a book we read in our Fascism and Nazism class in the fall, called On Tyranny, which shares 20 lessons from the 20th century. In that spirit, we are sharing 20 takeaways from our study in Berlin. If you have questions when listening, you will have an opportunity to ask them during the Q&A after the presentation.
So one of the key lessons that I took away was from the course Fascism and Nazism that we took before the class. We studied what a fascist regime was and how it happens. And what we learned was that fascism is not unique to the fascist regimes of World War II. Fascism is an autocracy of culture rather than just a simple autocracy, where only one culture is allowed and everybody else is labeled the outsider and an enemy. And in that, all individuality is stripped away. This is still an option today, and one that we need to be watchful for.
One of the earliest and most important lessons I took out of the Fascism and Nazism course was learning to understand and define the difference between nationalism and patriotism. In the US right now, those words get thrown around a lot and not necessarily always correctly. So the best definition I've come across is in Timothy Schneider's 2017 book, On Tyranny. You should read it. So I'm just going to read a few little quotes from it defining this difference. A nationalist encourages us to be our worst and then tells us that we are the best. A patriot, by contrast, wants the nation to live up to its ideals, which means asking us to be our best selves. A patriot must be concerned with the real world, which is the only place where his country can be loved and sustained. A patriot has universal values, standards by which he judges his nation, always wishing it well and wishing it would do better. A nationalist will say it can't happen here, which is the first step towards disaster. A patriot says it could happen here, but that we will stop it.
We talked about a very difficult time in history during this whole abroad, and so something that we talked about a lot was moving through and not on. We said that we learned that it was important to learn about and work through difficult history in order to understand the causes and effects of some of the darkest moments of the past. Through this hard-won knowledge, we were able to make connections between the past and the present. Moving through and not on gives us the ability to, 1, recognize dangerous patterns, 2, make more informed decisions, and 3, fully respect the victims.
So on this abroad, we covered very difficult topics and looked at very, very difficult historical events. And so one of the things that I was curious about was how this is handled today in Germany. And before traveling there, I had no clue what actions they had taken to rectify the events of the past. But through a jurisprudence assignment that had kind of a philosophy take on it, I did research to see if Germany had kind of made up for their past mistakes. And sadly, it's not a black and white answer, but I can lay out the numbers in front of you. The Luxembourg Agreement of 1952, Germany signed a bill, I think it started with West Germany signed a bill to give 1.53 billion euros to the State of Israel and victims of the Holocaust. Over time, that has turned into $74 billion in euros in reparations, and 29 billion of this was paid to victims. And I also found an interesting story about a woman in Minnesota, in rural Minnesota, who receives a check every year from the German government for being a victim of the Holocaust. So this was a really interesting example to me of how a country lives with its difficult past, and it was a way of kind of seeing how these events of the past can make an attempt to be rectified. And that's exactly what I argued in my paper, is that you really can't take back what happened in the Holocaust, but clearly, you know, they've given a lot of money to try to make this right. And the nice thing is that Germany itself largely acknowledges that it's one of those things that really you can't pay back. But, you know, that's a lot of money to show that they're putting forth effort.
On a lighter note, football or soccer. So Berlin has two major teams. They're Hertha Berlin and Union Berlin. And basically, they're both bad. So Hertha Berlin plays here at the Olympic Stadium where the Olympics of 1936 were held. And this is a shirt of Union Berlin. And why they're bad? Well, basically because the wall was built and the country was divided. So what happened with Hertha Berlin, which is in West Berlin, is that they were isolated. They could not play other teams. They didn't have competition, and they couldn't attract players because who wants to go to West Berlin and be trapped? So, and for Union Berlin, the problem was they were in East Berlin. And so they were basically playing against the government because the government supported another team, and they got refs and players to benefit their team, BFC Dynamo. And Union Berlin was screwed. They were their biggest rivals, but they couldn't win much. So, where am I? So yeah, and when the wall came down, Union Berlin was screwed because they were much worse financially than West Berlin teams, and they couldn't compete. So basically, sports can have a huge impact, even history can have a huge impact in sports, and it shows in Berlin.
So in the years leading up to and during the Holocaust, many Jews and other persecuted people parted with their homes, their artwork, and other valuable possessions. These things were frequently stolen, but often were given up or sold to the Nazis, and many people have labeled these transactions as voluntary. But it's important to remember that consent given under duress is not consent. The power difference between violent Nazis who controlled the state and people who were losing more and more rights every day was enormous, and therefore anything sold was not truly consensual. And this clarification in consent is important because as decades and centuries pass, it becomes easier and easier to simplify the past and ask victims why they seemingly complied. But when you understand consent, you avoid blaming victims and instead advocate for their justice in memory and in history.
So my lesson is number 7, and it's the importance of valuing memory. This is something that stuck out to all of us that we sort of figured out right at the beginning of the Abroad, was how we were constantly surrounded by history, whether that was in train stations, on the sidewalks, or in art museums. We were constantly surprised by all we could consume by getting from point A to point B. Beyond this, it also became clear through some of our research while in country that Germany has taken many steps towards grappling with our complex history. One example is a research project, which is the Stumbling Stones, which we saw some of in the video. These stones are all around the city of Berlin on the sidewalks, and they include the name of a Holocaust victim with their lifetime and the concentration camp that they were killed at. And those are located either where the person lived or where the person worked. And so through that and through many monuments, memorials, and museums, as well as a concentration camp that we visited, it became very clear that Germany has taken a lot of really important steps towards valuing memory and towards keeping those memories alive. And this continues to ring true to this day.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about generational trauma. And like what I want you to get from this is that like the events of the past, like generations past, inform how people live in the present in Berlin society. So like a good example is this photo, which like looks cool, but if you look closely at the columns, like there's bullet holes in the columns from fighting in Berlin during World War II. And you see that all over Berlin. Like there have been so many centuries of violence in Central Europe, and like Germany has to like live with that past, and the German people have to live with that past. So in particular, World War II and the Soviet occupation following World War II have really scarred the German people because they did so many terrible things in World War II, and then they've had to live with that oppression as a result. And the point of that is that people now have learned to appreciate the value of having like freedom and democracy and treating people fairly. So you see that they have a very healthy democracy in Berlin, and that's because of generational trauma.
So I had one of the most impactful stories was visiting the Jewish Museum. This is a photo of us, and Chris was the one who took it, so that's why he's not in it. But one of the exhibits in particular was about this artist who was telling their mother's story about the Holocaust, and it was very creative the way it was shown. There was stories, quotes on the ground. There was a gumball machine that had little stories, and you had to translate it because it was in German, but the stories were about people during the Holocaust and how they escaped and their life through it. And it was honestly one of the first few times I've seen a past that's really hard expressed in a creative way. And I think that was really impactful. And that's why it's really important to tell your story, because you always have a perspective on it that's different. And I think the African Quarter, which I visited on one of my individual study days, is something that could benefit from it, because having Afro-Germans tell their story would help Germany take accountability of its colonial past.
Okay, so what is denazification? So what happens when you have a country of millions and millions of people, and millions and millions of them were murderers or saw murder and decided to live with it? What happens is Germany, after the end of the war, was split into quarters. Well, Berlin, East and West Berlin, and then East and West Germany. And there are programs to denazify Germany. That means educational programs, financial, and basically all aspects of the country were used to kind of eradicate Nazism. This meant sending people to prisons. This meant acknowledging that almost all Germans had a role to play in this, them grappling with that idea in their history and agreeing to not only showcase it, as you guys have seen, but also move past it. It's not something that was easy. It's something that is still alive and still happening. Many of the museums we still went to are still trying to catalog some of the things they have. They're still trying to find more names, find more people, place more stones, as Eloise talked about. And it's a process that I think is going to take them probably the next 20 to 50 years. But Germany is ready to acknowledge their past and move past it. Well, most of Germany.
It's going to be another fun one. One of my biggest takeaways that overlooked both our fascism and Nazism class and the semester here in Illinois, and then going to Germany and then coming back, was the vastly different state of the legacy of the Nazis. In Germany, Nazism, Nazi symbols, Nazi salutes, Nazi chants are like super illegal. You will go to jail for doing them. It's been largely stamped out there. In the US, that's not quite the same case. Two main examples that came to my mind as I was thinking about this lesson is the 2017 riot in Charlottesville, Virginia, the Unite the Right rally, where Nazi and Confederate flags were waved, Nazi salutes were done. There were hundreds of people waving torches, chanting things like blood and soil, and the Jews will not replace us. On January 6, 2021, in Washington, D.C., rioters could be seen wearing shirts that said things like Camp Auschwitz Staff and 6MWE, which stands for 6 million wasn't enough, referring to how many Jewish people were massacred in the Holocaust. Germany even responded to some of those incidents with a spokesperson for German Chancellor at the time, Angela Merkel, saying, "The scenes at the right-wing extremist march were absolutely repulsive. The racism, anti-Semitism, and hate on display were in their most naked and evil form." In my own experience last fall and the summer before that, I'm from Boston. There were many swastikas graffitied around the city this summer. Coming back here to St. Louis last semester, there were swastikas graffitied around the city. I went grocery shopping last semester, and there was a swastika graffitied on my change, like on a dollar bill. So the lesson here really is that Nazism and anti-Semitism can largely be eradicated. They can mostly be stamped out. In America, we have not currently chosen to do that.
On, on a lighter note again, but not less important, still very important, the value of public transportation. So in Berlin, this was basically our life, taking trains, taking buses, taking trams, and walking. In fact, we did not take a single car or van in Berlin. The contrast to the US is pretty huge. Coming here as an international student, I had no idea how big the US was with cars and driving everywhere and not even having sidewalks sometimes. So I was kind of shocked. And why is it important to have this, to have transportation, to have a walkable city? So it provides different means of transportation for people who are unable to drive or even unable to buy a car. It is better for the environment, as there are going to be less cars in the street and less pollution. And it decreases the space needed for roads and parking lots. This creates compact communities, like middle density communities, that usually are booming with life, on contrary to American cities like St. Louis, full of huge roads, or Houston especially. So this, everything, betters the environment, creates a better life, it increases, and it's kind of scientifically proven, there are many research saying, it increases happiness of the people and increases economic activity. So it's the value of public transportation in a walkable city.
I'm guessing most of us have been to American history museums. You walk in, there's an object, there's a plaque that says what it is, you read it, and you forget about it later. In Berlin, we learned about a lot of better ways to portray history. We met an academic who was talking about using academic graphic novels to portray academic ideas like activism or history. And the history that was portrayed there was portrayed much better and more effectively. These are stumbling blocks. They're in the pavement. They show where somebody was, where somebody worked or lived who was usually killed in the Holocaust. And they're just in the pavement as you're walking around, and you see them, and their impact is really insightful because it reminds you of how much it's right there. A lot of the museums that we went to were also in the location that they happened. For example, the German-Russian Museum was in the location where Germany surrendered to Russia to end the war in Europe. And these ideas portrayed history in a much more memorable way so that they could be taken in so much easier.
It's very easy to look at much of the troubled history of Berlin and be tempted to label people as good or bad. But to do so is to lose so much of the value of a culture and its people. Human beings are deeply complicated and nuanced, and there is so much more value in understanding why people behave in the ways that they do than deciding that they're good or bad entirely. Every person is capable of great harm and great good. The key to grappling with this is to tell as much of the story as you can. In the case of the Holocaust, victims are given better justice when you understand how people became indoctrinated into committing unspeakable atrocities rather than just calling the Nazis bad guys and leaving it at that. There is a memoir by a Holocaust survivor named Thomas Bergenthal called A Lucky Child, and he talks about the importance of treating Germans with humanity. He says, "It was important that the rest of us who had been subjected to terrible suffering at the hands of the Germans treat them with humanity, not because we sought their gratitude or wanted to show how generous in spirit we were, but simply because our experience should have taught us to empathize with human beings in need, regardless of who they were."
One of the things I learned from Germany is that we can live in a better world if we're all reliable and active humanitarian partners. And what we heard about Germany and Berlin in general is that there were a lot of refugees from Ukraine who were able to find asylum in Germany and Berlin and able to register and work and get back on their feet. And in particular, we met with a Dr. Gilbert, who was a professor at one of the universities. And he told us about his own experience where he got to host a family, I believe, of Ukrainians who were able to seek asylum in Berlin. And we can all benefit from a world where we all work together towards a better future and help other countries in need.
Lesson 16 is making culture accessible. This lesson was something that really struck me throughout the process of the abroad. What was made clear to me is that Germany, again, has taken steps towards creating a more accessible way for attaining information and culture. This became clear in many, if not all, of the museums we visited that had tactile paths for the blind and visually impaired, as well as tactile versions of artwork. I personally had never thought about how a blind or visually impaired person experiences an art museum, and this was very eye-opening for me. Also, at many of the museums we went to, they had American Sign Language, or ASL, offered. So clearly, Germany has taken a lot more steps than elsewhere, especially here, towards making culture as accessible as possible. Then we had 2 individual research days on our abroad. On the very first one, I focused on the history of the treatment of queer and disabled people under the Nazi regime. The museum I went to was eye-opening because of its representation of these 2 minority communities through many different mediums. Through the abroad, it became clear to me that Germany has continued to seek out ways to become more inclusive and respectful.
Lesson number 17 is learning in museums. It's impossible.
Just kidding.
I learned how to learn in museums on this trip. I am someone who does not like to read, and so I thought then, therefore, museums are not for me. Why I signed up for a trip that involves going to museums, multiple every day, was beyond me, but I ended up loving it, and I've been changed, and now I love museums. And so, as spoken about, the museums in Berlin are fantastic, and some of them are historical sites where the events actually happened, and those were my favorites. And then there's the famous Museum Island in Berlin, a group of 5, 6 amazing museums with countless artifacts. And then this is actually a picture of the Museum of Transportation and Technology that I went to on my individual study day. And you didn't really have to read much. You just looked at planes. And so that was awesome. But beyond this, interacting with museums was something that I learned how to do, both through kind of following others and learning from others, and then figuring out what worked for me. So going up to things that shocked me and brought me in and reading about them, not forcing myself to read everything, because that's just, torturous for me. And so I really just started to love museums as the trip progressed. And now I would say I truly have a genuine value and appreciation for museums.
Continuing the museum trend. As I said earlier, I'm an art major, so naturally, in all my free time, I went to art museums. Was it to avoid the sad history? Perhaps a little, but I had to go to the art museums. And what I found there was that the information that they give in German art museums focuses on the historical context of the pieces, the artists, and how they came to be part of the museum's collections, as we talked about earlier with consent under duress. They mentioned whenever they discovered that a piece that they had been stolen from a Jewish family, and they were able to track down the families. This is the one that I'm talking about. This is a series that they were able to track down the family members that had been stolen from, gave it back to them, and then purchased it again to put back into the museum. Usually museums, especially art museums in the US, tend to focus on artistic context and the significance of a piece in the art world specifically, and leave the viewer to research any historical context for themselves if they're interested. The difference of this is very significant because emphasis and information highlights the values of a place and its people, and there was no avoiding history in the art museums.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about the historical foundations of Berlin architecture and fashion now. Lesson 19 out of 20. So, like what I want you to get from this is that like history is like super alive in Berlin because it's just like, it's like such a gorgeous city. I thought this is a cool photo. Like you see like an old looking building right here, and then this is like a lot more modern. And you just see that all over Berlin. Like every building is like 5 stories tall because the plumbing wouldn't work above 5 stories for most of Berlin history. So like, it's like these like very like, just like consistent blocks that look like this, but like all different kinds of architecture. So it's just like absolutely gorgeous. And it's like from all of these different generations of Berlin history, like you got like the current, like the Federal Republic, like right now, you have like nothing before the 1600s because that's when the 30 Years' War happened and everything got burned down. But after that, there's a lot of really cool looking buildings, and history is really alive, and people, you just walk around and you feel that culture, like you imbibe that culture. And so people are super fashionable, you know? Like I was wearing this a lot in Berlin, and it's just like, it's super fun to be all dressed up like that. So like the history makes you feel like the weight of like art and stuff there. So it's super cool. Thank you.
Okay, so the vibrance of a city born in flames. Berlin has been through so much history. Our first day in Berlin, we had a tour where our tour guide Heidi basically told us about how many times Berlin has basically burned down and then been reborn and then burned down again, only to be reborn. And that culture is still very alive in Berlin. There's so many buildings that, as Rafter said, are so old. Like we went to a museum that is going to be closed for the next, I think, 10 years, and we're there for the last day was open. So that was great. And we just got to experience Berlin in a very enlightening way. And part of that was the people. While we're studying culture, that was really interesting seeing where they come from, but seeing where they are was more impactful. To see the fact that they were making faces at us in the trains because we couldn't shut up, or we were like, one of us was pronouncing things in a California-like accent, or like stuff like that. Like the way they like treat people and the way they look at people, they really value actual relationships and building actual friendships. And that was a really big lesson for all of us, to see a city that is resilient, that is always there, always alive. And part of the reason why we always kept our eyes and our hearts open for that was because every day we had a metaphysical lesson where one of us shared something to guide us through the day. And that kept us always seeking good. So we would go see a camp, and then we'd come back. And then Peter would tell us to go see Berlin. And then we'd go experience something incredibly beautiful, and then come back and share at the end of the day. So Berlin is a city that has everything in moderation, from love, light, history, pain, sadness, sorrow, and it's living through it. So yeah.
Thank you all so much for listening to our presentation. At this moment, I will invite the group to come up on stage, and we will open up for questions and answers. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free and speak clearly into the microphone.
Regarding lesson number 11, what do you feel would have to happen here for our country to take Nazism or the eradication of Nazism seriously?
I mean, that's a big question, but a few things that come to my mind. One is education, being really honest about what happened during the Holocaust, what led to the Holocaust. There's a right way to teach it at a right time, but censoring it is not the right way. And then being really vocal when you do see anti-Semitism in the US, because it's everywhere. It's not hard to spot and to call out and to call it out negatively, even if it's your friend making a joke about how Jews run the media or other like silly anti-Semitic conspiracies. It's really important to pull it out at the root. That's my opinion.
Excuse me, if I may. Just a thought.
So on a similar note, on a very similar note, I feel like a lot of people would say that the Holocaust and Nazism is the great tragedy in German history, and a lot of people would say that slavery and the legacy of slavery is the great tragedy in American history.
Thank you.
And I'm just wondering, there's obviously not a single definitive reason, but do you guys see a reason why in the United States we have dealt with the legacy of slavery differently than Germany has dealt with the legacy of the Holocaust? And how do you think we should implement methods that Germany has used to deal with the legacy of the Holocaust that in the United States we could use to deal with the legacy of slavery?
I think that is a great question, and there are a lot of parts to it, so I will try to answer as many as I can remember. In terms of why things weren't handled as similarly as they were to Germany, there's several reasons that I think of. One is that we didn't handle it early enough. There were early efforts after the Civil War in particular that were really fixing things under Reconstruction, and just sorry to be a little bit of history nerd, but after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, a lot of that just stopped happening. And then as generations passed, people started to feel that it was less immediately relevant, and so conversations like reparations that were happening initially and then stopped happening felt less relevant to people than they were immediately after the Civil War. In terms of what people can be doing now, I think that it's, again, really important to look at what other countries who have successfully done and repeat it here. Another one of the problems is that the perpetrators in the US didn't leave. In Germany, Nazism was either, again, as we mentioned, largely stamped out, or many of the Nazis were prosecuted or fled. And in the US, you had slave catching patrols who became policemen. And so the way that we treated the perpetrators after the fact is extremely different, and because of that allowed for kind of a historical tolerance of that kind of atrocious behavior. So I would say going forward, looking at, again, matters of reparations, but also just historical consciousness. I know that there is a huge debate going on in education right now about how we talk about America's racist history and slavery, but I would say it is extremely important to, again, as we've all talked about, tell the story and tell the whole story.
You guys talked about transportation and how easy transportation is in Germany. In this wonderful and booming city of Elsa, we have a great challenge of transportation, especially in a school that's largely international. My question for you guys is, what solutions to transportation did you bring home? Because I feel like the purpose of Principia taking people abroad is to come back and make a difference in their wonderful home. So what changes did you guys bring for me specifically so that I can use that to brag in my end of year speech?
Well, yeah, great point. We don't have public transportation around here. We do have a couple buses going around Alton, Jerseyville, but we don't have a bus coming here. And I think it's very relevant nowadays, especially just more international students are coming than American students. So I think it's, I've been thinking about this lately, about trying to get a bus line that comes here at least once a week. Like, how difficult can that be? And take us to Alton and can take us somewhere else, I don't know. So William apparently has an idea.
Yeah, so there were these little electric scooters that you could rent with an app, and that could get you like halfway to Alton.
I look forward to hearing about the scooters. So my question has to do with food. How was the food? Did you get sick of the food? Did you all like the food? What was the best besides donors?
Sorry, you were
Gloria.
Going, yeah. Sorry, I cut you off there.
You're okay.
The food was so good. So let me give you an average day in my life. I wake up, I go to the gym, Grace is there at like 6:20 in the morning, and then we go to breakfast, and we like got this enormous buffet every morning, got like nice coffee machines, so I was getting myself some cappuccinos every morning. It was so nice. And then you go around Berlin, and like there's a ton of boba, if you know boba. Super into boba right now, it's so good. And then there's this like really good food called doner kebab as well. William, stop laughing, thank you. There's this like really good food called doner kebab, and it's like meat and bread and lettuce. It's super healthy. It's super good. And then there's just like a bunch of other food that's like fun. Like what are the hot dogs there called that have Indian food on them? Currywurst. They're fun. So like there's just a bunch of like fun food and like a bunch of diverse food because there's so many cultures in Berlin. So it's like really fun. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, Raptor said it perfectly. The food is amazing. I was talking to my mom while we were on the abroad, and she was like, "You're just posting a lot of pictures of food." I was like, it was really great. But I think we can all agree, yeah, Raptor said it perfectly. Like, it's incredibly diverse there. We had, when we were just meeting with various like print contacts or other people in the area, we had Vietnamese food. I know a bunch of us had, you know, Thai food, obviously German food. Like, we had pretty much every cuisine under the sun. And something that we all talked about too while we were eating is, one, a lot of the food is very affordable, and two, it's just kind of cleaner or like better made than a lot of the food in the US. And I know that there are people who are on the Music in Europe Abroad who echo that sentiment, where the food, yes, it's amazing and delicious, but it also just kind of is better for you too. So it was great.
Just to emphasize a note that was kind of mentioned here too, on the diversity front, I mean, when I came back here, people would ask me like, "Oh, did you have a bunch of German food? How was it?" And I'm like, I ate more Turkish food there than German food, which is kind of interesting, and it's really, really good. But it's also really indicative of the amount, you know, the size of the Turkish population, for instance. In Berlin and Germany as a whole is really, really welcoming to migrants and immigrants, and it just creates room for these really thriving, amazing cultural pockets in Berlin.
Speaking on the eating German food, I think I had German food once and we had to seek it out. But I think my favorite meal was definitely sushi, which surprises everybody that I've spoken to.
My question is about the lesson number 4. That's for you, William. The restorations don't passively happen. So I would like you to assess what you learn from your vast experience in abroad. Just recall that you are going to a fort abroad now in summer, and to try to assess the Germany restoration efforts compared to the darkest Spain period.
I have you to thank for that fourth abroad, so thank you. I'll start by saying I spoke to our RC for the abroad, Tracy, about this, how I'm currently learning about Spain and the dark history in Spain, and then in this abroad I learned about Germany, and very thoroughly how they've handled the events of the past. And it's two very, very opposite approaches to dealing with a very difficult past. For those of you that don't know, under Francisco Franco and the civil war that happened in Spain, 500,000 Spaniards died. And Spain approaches that by largely forgetting and moving on, and living kind of the happy culture that most people know Spain has. And so I felt like, as an outsider, I can't say which is better, but I can say that Berlin very thoroughly has sunk a lot of money into appropriately addressing the Holocaust and trying to make things right. As I said, I don't believe you can, replace lives with euros. But in terms of Spain, I'm excited to learn more about it and see how they've approached it. But to the same sentiment, I think as an outsider, all I can do is look. I can't judge someone else's experience or how a nation handles their past, their difficult past. And so I'm excited to learn more about Spain, but that was one of the most fascinating things that I learned about on this trip. And I think we'll do one more question.
I would like to hear you speak about ways in which you were surprised by this trip. Or did you already anticipate what things you saw, what things you learned while you were on the abroad? Tell me a little bit about what you personally were surprised about.
I'll just say I didn't know this going in, but when I got there were a lot of people that looked like me, and because you're my family, we have German heritage, and so it was strange because people would walk up to me or at a restaurant would expect me to speak German, and so that was shocking for me, and I kind of had to mentally process that I'm in a place where people who look like me tend to speak German, and so that was a surprise and a letdown for a lot of people that I didn't speak German.
We had 2 or 3 lessons about this, but what really surprised me was how closely entwined history and art were. You go to a history museum and you find a bunch of art and artistic ways to explain history. You go to an art museum and all you get is history lessons on the plaques. And it was fascinating. They so successfully strengthened each other and helped you learn about it in a way that really stuck with you because it was taking multiple disciplines to do it. And it was really cool.
I tried to go in with no prior assumptions, and it turned out that the biggest prior assumption that I had was that it was going to be cold there. And so I packed pants and sweatshirts and found out that I didn't really need them. And so, yeah, that surprised me.
I would say what surprised me was probably the bureaucracy, because I had a little bit of a different story. I ended up arriving on New Year's Eve instead of on the 29th like everyone else because of getting a visa. It had delayed and everything, but it was still a cool experience seeing everyone.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things. I'm sure every single one of us has like 10 things or more, things that surprise us or that we enjoyed a lot. But one thing that I found interesting was masks were still required in public transportation. That was surprising at first, and then a lot of people didn't really use masks, and that was surprising as well. So that's it.
That's cool. That's cool. So I have two things. One was that like you get on like a train. Are we going fast? Let's go fast. So you get on a train and like there's so many people speaking so many different languages. It's really cool because from America, like everybody speaks one language, you know, and that's cool. But like it's really cool to have something different and like makes me want to learn another language potentially. Who knows? And then also just like having access to those trains is so nice because like not having to drive is just like such a luxury to me. So yeah.
I think for me, my biggest shock was just the way German people all know about their past. Like every single German we met, whether young or old, seems to understand exactly where they're coming from, exactly where they're going. And it was fascinating to be like, this is a concentration camp in a neighborhood. Like there's people who live 5 minutes away. Like this is what they see every day. The little stumbling blocks on the ground, they're literally everywhere. They hit you right in the face to see like, oh, that used to be a train station. And right next to it is an office building, and they left it like half done so people can remember. So the way that they're choosing to live through their history, I think that was my biggest like shock.
Like everyone else, there were several things that surprised me. One of them was just the outpouring of support for Ukraine. When we were there, we talked about it a lot. You saw it in our video a few times. But the amount of support that the German people have for Ukrainians and their situation is enormous. It's something that is kind of part of current thought there. It's talked about a lot with the people that we met with. We discussed it with them as well. And so to see just how prevalent it is in their kind of current events was really interesting to see. And then something else that sort of connects to what Ari was saying about the art and the history being combined is just that I know we all had a lot of discussions about the things we saw, and a lot of them were really heavy, but just I think all of us were surprised at one time or another at what it was that kind of hit us or did it for us. We took in a lot of very serious content, and the content was always serious, but you respond to it in different ways. And there's things where, you know, like I am a history major, not an art major, but there were times where like the Falling Leaves exhibit, which were the photos that you saw of all of those metal faces that were on the ground. I know that for a lot of us that really connected with us, and a couple of us talked about the fact that you were allowed to walk on them, and some of us felt we couldn't do that. Like it just felt wrong to step on like thousands of metal faces. So yeah, I think something that surprised me is just what hit home for all of us in different instances.
This is a little bit nerdy as a history major, but I specifically study the 16th century, which is like way before what we're studying on This Abroad. So when I'm going to a European city on an abroad, I'm like, ooh, here, what's old, yay. And I was really shocked at how new everything was. Most of my European travel experience before this has been to the UK or to Spain. And there it's fairly regular to see buildings that are, you know, a few hundred to several hundred years old. And there was practically none of that in Berlin, which makes sense given the historical destruction in World War II and World War I and the 30 Years' War. And it's been a bit of a battleground for kind of its entire history. But it was really shocking to be going through this European city and expecting it to be old and having most buildings be newer than the buildings that, you know, I see back home in Boston was kind of shocking to me a little bit.
I think for me, it was learning how to go through a museum, kind of similar to what people were saying earlier. At the beginning, I couldn't really figure out like how much I wanted to read, how much I could like emotionally consume. And so I think that's one of the things that surprised me the most is how important that was to figure out for myself.
Okay, so thank you all for the questions. Before we conclude, we would all be remiss if we did not thank the incredible individuals who made This Abroad possible. So first, we would like to thank Allison Terry. We do have a gift for each of you, so you can come grab your gift if you want. But your tireless work and your godlike powers made the logistics of our abroad run harmoniously, and we are so thankful for your support, not only of us, but of all Principia Study Abroads. You are amazing. Next, we would like to thank Will Buchanan, our jurisprudence professor on the trip. Will not only educated us about the philosophy of the law, but made efforts to know each and every one of us personally. His dedication to the course content, friendly demeanor, and contacts in Berlin were deeply appreciated by all of us, so thank you. Next, we would like to thank truly the most amazing abroad RC, Katie Stanley. Katie has the magical ability to fix problems before they ever pop up. Whether she was providing a listening ear, managing our receipts, taking incredible photos, recommending a great book, or sharing insights, Katie excelled, and we are so lucky to have had her on the trip. And finally, our utmost gratitude extends to our abroad leader. This was the first run ever of the Berlin Abroad, and without Peter, none of it would have happened. Peter's love for the city of Berlin and its history was infectious, and the knowledge he shared with us was deeply impactful. He was the best culinary tour guide and one of the funniest people to quote on the abroad. Peter taught the history of Berlin with great intellect, respect, and profound empathy, and we are so grateful for his role in this abroad. Thank you all. We hope you enjoy. There is dessert and tea and beverages right out there if you are interested. Thank you.